Hi, Leon. You know me. I'm Steve Hunnigs, your old-time friend.
You bet.
And everyone, I'm here with the privilege and the honor of interviewing Leon Frankel today. I grew up in the neighborhood in which Leon lived. I was always fascinated and, again, honored by the stories he told about his service to our country and then ultimately Israel in the 1948 war. But today we're going to focus upon Leon's service in the United States Navy. The reason I'm here today, a few days before December 7, the 70th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack, is I want to hear from Leon about his recollections of December 7 and the like, and why that inspired him to serve, and a little bit about his service in the United States Navy in the Second World War. First, Leon, why don't we start, if you could give us 2, 3, 4 minutes of just an overview of your service during the Second World War in the United States Navy, then everyone would understand the context of what you're saying.
Well, I wound up joining the U.S. Navy Air Reserve, and in 1942, I was sworn in September of 1942, and began my training in December of 1942, which ultimately led to my graduation in November of 1943 from Pensacola, Florida, where I opted to become a pilot of a torpedo bomber, and subsequently was assigned to the very famous Air Group 9, which had just returned from a year's deployment and were reforming in the Seattle area. And I was very fortunate to be selected to be part of the reformed torpedo squadron and air group. So that was the start of my military adventures in the Navy.
Just for a little more background, when did you, with Air Group 9, after that was reformed, how long was it before you ultimately joined an aircraft carrier or were assigned to an aircraft carrier?
Well, we trained, Air Group 9 trained in Pasco, Washington for several months, and then we trained some more in San Diego, where we received our carrier landing practice. And then we were deployed to Hawaii, where we trained with the Marine Division, which was getting ready to make a landing. And then we did some more training in the Admiralty Islands and didn't go aboard a carrier until February of 1945. The first assignment for Air Group 9 was the USS Lexington, which was to participate in an attack on Japan. It was the first naval attack on Japan since the Doolittle raid of 1942. And I was very fortunate to be one of the pilots picked for that particular mission. And we went up to Tokyo with an armada which has never been equaled since. There were 19 carriers in the task force, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, all sorts of support ships. And our mission was to destroy as much of the Japanese aircraft infrastructure as we could prior to the landing at Iwo Jima. And the target assigned to Air Group 9 was the Nakajima Aircraft Factory at Ota, Japan, which produced about 50 or 60% of the Japanese operational aircraft in World War II. A huge factory. We launched in the morning, and after our fighters had gone earlier in the day, had gone at pre-dawn actually, they had a launch, where the fighters went up there and raised as much havoc as they could at the Japanese airfields in and around Tokyo and environs. And but even so, when we approached the target, we were jumped by over 50 fighters who poured through the formation and one of them slammed right into my skipper's airplane right in front of me. Fortunately for the skipper, it hit the Japanese fighter hit his propeller and bent it about 2 of the 3 blades out of like bananas, but he was able to maintain his flight in spite of it. The Japanese fighter, of course, lost a wing and spun into the ground. So I pulled alongside of him and to help him slow down to escort him back to the carrier, which I subsequently did, and he put me in for the DFC.
Which is?
The Distinguished Flying Cross.
Which is the second highest citation from the Navy, correct?
Well, not the second highest. The Silver Star is higher than the Navy Cross, of course, which I got later on. It is the highest that the Navy can give.
How is it that you helped the skipper in the flight back to the carrier?
Well, I throttled back as much as I could and stayed right alongside of him while my gunner was fighting off the attackers. And we were soon joined by others in the group, and we sort of formed a cocoon around him to protect him.
Nice. Along
with another airplane that was also damaged in the attack.
And the skipper had to fly very slowly because of his propeller.
That's right. He could only maintain about 1,400 RPM, which is just enough to sustain flight, and that was about it. It took about an hour to get back to the carrier, and of course we were very jubilant that most of us made it back. We destroyed or put this aircraft factory pretty much out of commission, and so that was my first strike and my first attack, the very first one.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your participation in the attack on the Japanese cruiser for which you won the Navy Cross?
Okay. On April the 1st of 1945, the U.S. invaded Okinawa. And for a week, the Marines hardly saw, or Army saw, any opposition. The Japanese had adopted a new tactic. Instead of meeting the invading force on the beach and fighting there, they decided to let them come ashore. And there were anywhere from 85 to 100,000 Japanese soldiers who'd been digging in there since the 1920s. And on April 7th, the Japanese decided they had some remaining assets in their fleet, among them the world's largest battleship, the Yamato, the cruiser Yahagi, and 9 destroyers. And on the 7th of April, they dispatched them to Okinawa to raise as much cane as they could down there with their naval force. And then, because they only had fuel for a one-way trip, they decided they were going to beach the ships and join the fighting force on the land. However, they were intercepted immediately upon their sortie. They were only about 75 or 80 miles from Kyushu, where they sortied, when they were discovered, and the attacks began. And it was the first time in my naval experience as a torpedo bomber pilot that I ever carried a torpedo. Even though the airplane was designated a torpedo bomber, we carried bombs and rockets and everything but torpedoes. It was the first time that we received over the teletype load with torpedoes. And when we arrived on the scene where the ships were, they'd been under attack for an hour or two before we got there. And the Yamato had been struck by several other airplanes and was listing about 15 degrees and heading back to Kyushu. And the Yahagi was off about 10 miles away with a screening destroyer, and it also had been struck. So when we got on the scene, there were 13 of us in that attacking group in VT-9, our torpedo squadron. I think there were 15 assigned, but 2 didn't make it off the deck for some, they had mechanical problems or something.